بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. The next topic that we're going to move on to is Babu Shurut al-Salati. Babu Shurut al-Salati refers to the conditions of prayer. In other words, the conditions, certain aspects that have to be present in order are conditional. These are things that are considered conditional either for the obligation of prayer, meaning in order for the prayer to be obligatory on somebody, or for the soundness of the prayer. In order to bring that closer, we have, when we're talking about the conditions of prayer, we can split them into two categories. The first one is what we call shurutu wujub. And shurutu wujub refers to those elements or those specific things that have to be present in order for the prayer to be considered obligatory. For example, there's some times when the prayer is not considered obligatory. For example, before the prayer time comes in, there is no obligation to pray Dhuhr or to pray Asr or to pray Maghrib, because the obligation, the condition for the obligation has not set in. Or, for example, a person who reaches the age of puberty. A person before he reaches the age of puberty, when Dhuhr time comes in, although the condition of the presence of the prayer time is in, there's something else, there's another condition that is not met in order for the prayer to be obligatory on him, and that is puberty. He has not reached puberty, and so prayer is not obligatory on him. So that is what we taught. That's what we mean when we say shurutu wujub, the conditions that have to be present in order to necessitate that the prayer is obligatory on any individual. Then we move on to something called shurut al-siha. Shurut al-siha are those things in which the prayer is dependent upon in order to be sound. An example of that is having wudu. Having wudu, meaning being in the state of wudu or in a state of purity, is a condition for the soundness of the prayer. So this is what he's going to talk about here. But just to touch upon the point again, that understand that when we talk about conditions and we talk about obligatory acts, the outcome is the same. For example, we said that we're going to mention that one of the obligatory prayers is ruku'ah, making a ruku'ah, going into the bowing position. If you weren't to do it, then your prayer wouldn't be sound. Likewise, if you didn't make wudu, your prayer wouldn't be sound as well. But what is the difference between an obligatory act and a condition of soundness? We're going to recognize that the difference between the two of them is that when we say that something is obligatory, it's actually part of the prayer, meaning that it is one of the elements of the prayer itself. When we talk about the conditions of soundness, we're going to come to notice that they are things that are related to the prayer, but they are not the prayer itself. For example, wudu. Making wudu is not part of the prayer itself. And so we don't say it's an obligatory act, we say it's a condition for soundness. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The author says, وَلِلصَّلَاةِ شُرُوتُ وُجُوبٍ وَشُرُوتُ صِحَّةٍ. And related to prayer are two things. Shurutu wujubin, the conditions, or you can say وَلِلصَّلَاةِ, prayer has shurutu wujubin, the conditions. And we mentioned what the shurutu wujub are. Was shurutu sihhatin, and we mentioned what the shurutu sihhatin are. And now he's going to go on to mention the shurutu wujub. So he says, فَأَمَّا shurutu wujubiha, as for the conditions, the shurutu wujubiha for the prayer, meaning and those shurutu wujub for the prayer, فَخَمْسَةٌ, they are 5. So he's going to now mention the 5. He said that they're 5, so he's now going to list off the 5 things. The first one he says is al-Islam. So what he means here to say that until a person is a Muslim, then the prayer is not obligatory on him because he hasn't accepted Islam yet. But according to the sound position, of the Maliki school, the sound position is that Islam is not a condition for the obligation of prayer. Meaning that even the non-Muslim is obligated to pray. And what do we mean by he's obligated to pray? Meaning that although a non-Muslim, although he doesn't pray, or although he's not Muslim, although he's not obligated to, although he doesn't pray because he's not a Muslim, does not necessitate that the prayer is not obligatory on him. What does that mean? In the ayat, Allah mentions in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, it was said to the mushrikeen, مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي السَّقَرِ, what has dragged you to the hellfire? And their response was, قَالُوا, they said, لَمْ نَكُمْ مِنَ الْمُسَلِّينَ, they said that we weren't from the people al-musallin, meaning we were not of the people who prayed. And so according to the Malikiya, they understood this ayah to mean if the non-Muslim is being punished, if is going to be punished in the hellfire because they didn't pray, it means that their prayer was obligatory on them, because if it wasn't obligatory on them, then why would they be punished for it? For example, if a young child doesn't pray, he's not punished for it because puberty is one of the conditions that have to be there in order for the prayer to be obligatory. So in a nutshell, what it means here is although Islam is a condition for the prayer to be sound, it does not necessitate that the prayer in itself is not obligatory, because as we've seen in the verse here, that when the non-believers are asked, why are you being punished in the fire, or why are you being dragged to the fire, they say that we were not one of the musallin, we were not one of the people who used to observe the prayer. So based on that, the scholars of the Maliki madhab, the sound position of the Maliki madhab, is that al-Islam is not one of the conditions of wujub. So what the author here is mentioning is he's mentioning the weak opinion, and the weak opinion is based on the position that the non-believers are not responsible to fulfill the issues of, to fulfill the obligatory acts of Islam. So in reality, Islam is not, according to the sound position as mentioned before, is not a condition is not from the shurut to wujub. And so what he mentions here is the weak opinion according to the Malikiyah. Then he mentions wal-bulugh. Wal-bulugh means that, bulugh technically means puberty, reaching the age of puberty. And reaching the age of puberty, once a person reaches the age of puberty, then the prayer will become obligatory on them. Otherwise, for a child who has not reached the age of puberty, then it is not obligatory for them to observe the prayer. And in terms of puberty, there are certain signs that necessitate that a person has reached the age of puberty. And those signs for the boys are things like ejaculation. If a boy has ejaculation, then that would necessitate that he has entered, or having a wet dream would necessitate that he has entered the age of puberty. For females, it would be the likes of menstruation. For example, a girl sees menstruation for the first time, it means that she enters the age of puberty. Or the sprouting of hair in the midsection of the private section, then that would also, or under the armpits, that would also necessitate that the person has reached the age of puberty, or also if they another one for women, if they reach the age, if they were to become pregnant, and becoming pregnant also necessitates that a girl has entered into the state of puberty, and thus once they hit the age of puberty, then it becomes obligatory on them to pray. The third one that he mentions is wal-aqlu. Wal-aqlu has to be there in order for the prayer to be obligatory on them, which means that if a person was in a state of a concussion, or in the state of a coma, or sleeping, or fainted, then while they're sleeping or while they're in that state, then it is not obligatory for them to perform the prayer. But it should be understood that that does not mean that if a person were sleeping, for example, the whole period of Asr, and then he were to wake up, it doesn't mean that since the prayer wasn't obligatory on him, doesn't necessitate that it is not obligatory for him to make qada, because it is obligatory for him to make qada if he oversleeps the prayer until the prayer comes out. And there's no dispute amongst the Malikiya that prayer in this case would be obligatory. So that's wal-aqlu. Also, al-aqlu can also refer to a person who has been, for example, possessed by a jinn, which they say is majnoon, and a person who has been affected by a jinn, and therefore, although they are awake, their intelligence is not present during their time of being possessed, for example, then the prayer would not be obligatory on them, because aqlu, which we can say means mental awareness, or mentally, or you can translate majnoon as mentally impaired, possibly. But what aqlu is referring to is the state when a person is not mentally aware, then they are observed, or the prayer is not obligatory on them. But when their senses come back, it is obligatory for them to make qada, even if the coma were to last for years on end. Once that coma was to go away, or they were to awaken from the coma, they would be obligated to make up the prayer. Then he mentions the next one, which is dukhul al-waqti, which the entering of the prayer time. So until the prayer enters, it's not considered it's not obligatory on the person to perform the prayer. And the understanding this condition helps us to pinpoints the issue of fiqh concerning a person who went to sleep before the prayer time entered. For example, according to the Malikiya, let's say the prayer of Dhuhr didn't enter until 1:30, and a person wanted to go to sleep at 1 o'clock, but he knew that he wasn't going to be able to wake up before Dhuhr time were to go out. Technically speaking, we would say that he's not a sinner. And the reason why he's not a sinner is because the time that he chose to go to sleep at, he wasn't responsible, or he wasn't being held responsible for the obligation of Dhuhr in the first place, because the obligation does not set in until Dhuhr enters. So before that, he is not requested by the Sharia to fulfill anything of the Dhuhr prayer, because Dhuhr hasn't come in. And so there's nothing that's prohibiting him from going to sleep. But if Dhuhr time was to come in, and he knew that if he went to sleep, he wasn't going to be able to wake up until Dhuhr time ended, then here he would take the sin, because doing that is not permissible, because the obligation of the act has set in, and so one is obligated to perform it. So at this point, if he were to go to sleep knowing that he wasn't going to wake up, are even thinking that he wasn't going to wake up, are even in doubt that he wasn't going to wake up, meaning that he wasn't certain that he would wake up before the prayer time was over, then, and what we're referring to, as we'll talk about later, is the mukhtar time, not the daruri time, which will be something that will become clear later on. So in this case, the person would be sinning for going to sleep once the prayer time came in, contrary to if a person had an alarm and he set the alarm, or he agreed with somebody to wake him up before the prayer time came in, because now he has certainty, or at least close to certainty, that he will wake up on time. Then the last one, which is بلوغ دعوة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. يعني بلوغ دعوة النبي refers to those who have been given the message of Islam. يعني بلوغ, or I would better to say بلوغ دعوة النبي means that the message of Islam, or the message that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought, has reached the people. What does that mean? It means that those who have not heard the message are not responsible for the prayer, contrary to what we just mentioned before we mentioned that the non-believers will be punished in the hellfire for not observing the prayer, because they said مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي السَّقَرِ, and they said قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُنْ مِنَ الْمُسَلِّينَ, that we weren't from the people who prayed. This verse that I mentioned and the condition of Islam refers to those who heard about the message of Islam. For example, we're told about the pillars of Islam, we're told about the belief in Allah, and we're told about the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but did not accept the message. Then these are the ones that will be held accountable. But for those who did not hear the message in the first place, then Allah will not hold them accountable, based on the ayat of the Quran that we have never sent to a people, we have never destroyed a people except that we sent to them a messenger. And for this reason, we mentioned the condition of bulugh ad-da'wat an-nabi, which means we can translate bulugh ad-da'wat an-nabi is the reaching of the message of Islam that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has brought. So for those people in some countries of the world, or in some places of the world, who never heard about Islam, technically saying, we cannot say that they've rejected Islam, but they have not heard about Islam, and so Allah will judge them according to His wisdom. And then there are those who heard about the message of Islam. And it doesn't have to be a detailed message, it can be a very basic message, because it is the fitrah of a human being. Once they hear about Islam, it's to know that it's true. But their denying of it comes for some type of worldly gain, or for some other reason. They don't accept the deen of Islam, and therefore they're held responsible, as you mentioned before, even for not paying zakat, for not praying, for not fasting, on top of the punishment that they're already destined for. So it is important from here, important lesson that we learn from here is to understand that the word kafir, the word disbeliever, when used can be used in two ways. It can be used in its broader sense, and it can be used in a specific sense. And a lot of people don't distinguish here, and here is where they make the mistake. When we use it in the broader context, when we read the word kafir in a broader context, then what we're referring to is a non-Muslim, meaning a person who hasn't accepted Islam, whether he heard about the message or whether he didn't hear about the message, right? And then when it's used in its specific sense, which in most cases is how it is used in the Quran in its specific sense, meaning those who denied the message. So in most places of the Quran, when they're addressing the disbelievers, the word kafir is referring to the specific sense, those who turn their back after being given the message. So if we don't distinguish between these two, then it is easy for a person to be lax, and it's easy for a person to go to the extreme. So for example, a person will say all kafirs are destined to the hellfire, and so a person might hear that and assume that it means that every unbeliever will definitely go to the hellfire. Although that may be the case when it comes to those who have rejected Islam, it is not the case for those who have not heard the message. And for this reason, the ulama added the importance of mentioning that one of the conditions of the obligation of prayer is that the message of Islam has reached them, to distinguish between those who have heard the message and from those who have not heard the message. So that's an important point to pay attention to. Then it says وَأَمَّا الشُّرُوطُ. So he's mentioned the 5, and now he's going to move on. وَأَمَّا الشُّرُوطُ صِحَّتِهَا فَسِتَّةٌ. And as for the conditions of soundness, and we said the conditions of soundness are those things that have to be there, right? They have to be there in order for the prayer to be sound. The first thing that he mentions is taharatul hadath. Taharatul hadath here, what he means is to be in the state of purity. And what he's referring to here is either making wudu for those who wudu is obligatory upon, like the passing of gas and so on and so forth, and also those who are in the state of impurity, like after having sexual intercourse, then taharatul kubra, the big tahara, which is making ghusl, is obligatory on them. So that's what he means here by taharatul hadath. He's referring to both of them. After that, he mentions what taharatul khabath. Taharatul khabath means to remove the gross impurities. Taharatul khabath meaning izalat najasa. Izalat najasa meaning moving the impurities from the body. So removing impurities from the body is also obligatory. For example, if a person has urine on his clothes, even a drop, or feces, or for example, he stepped in some doggy waste, and it's on the bottom of his shoe. If he wants to pray with that shoe on, if he was outside in a park, for example, he would have to remove it. And so that's the sex. So the first condition we mentioned was remove the taharatul hadath, and the second one that we just mentioned here is taharatul khabath, removing the physical impurities. Then we have wastiqbalul qibla. Wastiqbalul qibla, if you're living in Mecca, it means to face the Kaaba directly. This is why when you look at pictures of Mecca, or you've been in Mecca for prayer, we stand around the Kaaba in a circle. But once we are outside of the Kaaba, then we have to be at least facing the direction of the Qibla. So within Mecca and its surrounding areas, it's obligatory to be directly in line with the Kaaba, meaning that your whole body has to be aligned with the Kaaba. Whereas when we are outside of Mecca and its neighboring areas, then it is sufficient enough to be facing the direction of the Qibla, not being in line with the Qibla. So that's what he means by wastiqbalul qiblati. Then he's going to mention was satr al-awrati. Satr al-awrati means to cover one's awra. And to cover one's awra in terms of being in prayer, covering one's awra for women means everything except the hands and the face. In terms of men, it means everything that is between the navel and the knees. So that's a general breakdown of what it means to cover the awrah, although there is more detail, but that is sufficient for now since it is a beginning book, that a woman should have everything except her hands and her face covered, and a man between what is between his stomach and his navel. Then he mentions وَتَرْكُ الْكَلَامِ وَتَرْكُ الْأَفْعَالِ الْكَثِيرَ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. Then he mentions وَتَرْكُ الْكَلَامِ. وَتَرْكُ الْكَلَامِ means to leave speech behind. So some of the authors have mentioned, or many of the authors have mentioned, that leaving speech is a condition for soundness, right? But that is understood in reality by making, when you make your takbiratul ihram, when you make the takbiratul ihram, it already necessitates the fact that you have to leave speech. But the ulama considered it from the shurut as-sihha, because if a person were to speak in his prayer, then his prayer would become invalid. So that's what he means by tark al-kalam, meaning that the soundness of the prayer is based upon, it's also necessary that a person is not speaking, أو وترك الأفعال الكثيرة, or leaving excessive movement in prayer is a condition for soundness, meaning that if a person were to make excessive movement without necessity, and what they mention by necessity are things like scratching one's back, or moving a line ahead in the saf when somebody leaves or when there's a gap, such things are considered necessities. But what they're talking about here is how they've defined what excessive movement is, meaning that if a person were to see you from a distance, they would think that you're not praying. Then that type of excessive movement would be considered what nullifies prayer. For example, if a person was in prayer and he yawned, and he was yawning for some reason, and he raised his hands, for example, or he picked up and answered his telephone, and that type of movement, that if a person was from a distance, or if a person was looking at them, they wouldn't think that they're in prayer, then that would nullify prayer. And then he mentions at the end, Wallahu alam, and Allah knows best. And so these are the things that determine these are the things in which the author mentions concerning the conditions of prayer. And as we mentioned, the conditions of prayer are split into two: shurutu wujub, which are 5. And we also mentioned the issue around the subject of Islam and the bulugh da'wat an-nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So one should pay attention to that. And we mentioned the shurut as-sihha, and we mentioned that they were 6, and that sums up in general the issues around the conditions of prayer.